So let's get into it. Farewell to Arms. I think this novel in particular stands out in the early Hemingway repertoire, not only for its beautiful, tragic story. I refer to A Farewell to Arms as sort of a form of Stoic tragedy. I'm not sure if that is a coined literary term, but we're bringing it to the forefront today. Stoic tragedy, Ernest Hemingway. So, what makes this Hemingway novel not only interesting, powerful, but what makes it important? And I would say that prior to Farewell to Arms, we had The Sun Also Rises. We had some of Hemingway's short stories as well. But A Farewell to Arms was really the first sort of quintessential Hemingway novel, the first Hemingway novel, if we could say that. Because of Hemingway's sparse, simplistic style, but also the story that he was telling. I would say that, this was Hemingway's first anti-war novel. But what's also profound about a Farewell to Arms is that it doesn't necessarily focus on the combat only, warfare, violence. It's more about the day-to-day happenings outside of combat. But obviously we have some horrific scenes of World War I, of the trench warfare, of obviously Frederick Henry getting terribly wounded in sort of the early stage of the book. And that's what adds to the tragedy of A Farewell to Arms. But without giving away too many spoilers, we also have a larger theme of tragedy that sort of occurs by the end of the novel. Just a quick rundown of World War I. Basically, it was started between the Central Powers of Europe and what later became known as the Allied Powers. After Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, the tensions have been growing between certain countries. I'm not an expert on World War I, but I did do a little bit of research just prior to this video so we could sort of understand the cultural legacy of World War I. Now, whether or not you want to become a World War I expert, you don't need to be one to read or to enjoy A Farewell to Arms. But what you do need to know is that World War I was a horrific war. It was one of the first wars that introduced some of the brutalities of trench warfare. It also introduced military tanks. It was the beginning of flamethrowers and, certain types of bombs, certain types of really brutal, death-defying artillery. And by the end of the World War I, they had millions and millions upon millions of casualties. So definitely not a war to be reckoned with, definitely not a war to be forgotten. And in terms of Hemingway's life, in terms of Hemingway's repertoire, his oeuvre, if we want to call it, it was one of the first major tragedies of Hemingway's life. Frederick Henry is the main protagonist, who is basically a stand-in for Hemingway himself. He's basically a volunteer for the Red Cross on the Italian front in Italy. And Italy was one of the Allied powers among U.S. and France, I believe, and Japan and some other countries that were allied against the Central Powers. But basically, that's all you need to know in terms of why Frederick Henry is in Italy. So we talked about the war briefly, but we also talked about sort of the day-to-day happenings behind the scenes or outside of combat. And that's really what this novel, to me, focuses on. Obviously, there is some very heroic, action-packed, brutal, violent scenes of World War I, but it's more about Frederick Henry's relationship with everybody else and how they impact him on a day-to-day basis. And obviously, you'll get the action-packed war scenes. You'll get the depressing atmosphere that occurs during war, obviously, but you also get the simplistic ways that Frederick Henry and the other characters are able to enjoy life during this tragic war. In the beginning, we mentioned that A Farewell to Arms is basically a Stoic tragedy. What do I mean by that? How can somebody be stoically tragic? How can you have a Stoic tragedy? Well, that's basically the mood and the mode of Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. This novel functions as not only a Stoic tragedy, but also as a form of scriptural therapy during all these horrific events. You can definitely read many of Hemingway's works, in fact, as a form of scripture. Hemingway was heavily influenced by the Bible. He even used a lot of his book titles that were taken from the Bible, or at least inspired by the Bible. So there's something to be said for the biblical and / religious influence that occurs in A Farewell to Arms, as well as many other Hemingway works. Obviously, this is a war novel. We could dare to say it's even an anti-war novel if we want to go that far. But really, before we even get to all that or even speculate on that, Farewell to Arms is basically a Stoic tragedy, because despite all of the trauma, emotionally, mentally, socially, spiritually, that Frederick Henry undergoes during the course of this story, he remains stoic, he remains masculine, he remains brave. And I think that is part of sort of the way that the novel is written in Hemingway's quintessential simplistic, almost sort of lackadaisical style, not in terms of the writing, but the way that he sort of, his worldview is kind of lackadaisical in terms of the way that he accepts everything that is happening and occurring around him. There's never really any sense of real bitterness that I really got from it. I mean, yeah, he's sort of maybe tongue-in-cheek a little bit. What's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. The word lackadaisical keeps coming to my mind, because he's just sort of like, okay, this is what's happening. Give me another drink. There's really no sort of resistance to what occurs. And Hemingway, quick background on Hemingway, he was currently writing articles for the Kansas City Star. The young Hemingway was basically trying to avoid going to combat, or at least serving in the army per se. He wasn't trying to avoid combat, or he would not have been in Italy serving for the American Red Cross. But he was basically trying to avoid having to go to college. He was trying to avoid having to serve prolonged time in the military. So he joined up with the Kansas City Star, writing articles as a journalist. Somewhere along the line in 1918, he heard from a mutual friend that the American Red Cross in America was recruiting volunteers to drive ambulances in Italy. So he sort of signed up and was brought onto the Italian front to sort of help assist the soldiers, not only physically, but he was also dispersing cigarettes and chocolate and beverages, perhaps. And that's actually when Hemingway was knocked unconscious by a mortar shell. You guys can read more about Hemingway's near-death experience. He claims that he could not move his body, he could not speak, but he sort of felt his soul leaving his body up sort of like into the wind, just like a piece of paper or a piece of cloth. In hindsight, it may have been the first concussion that Hemingway actually potentially suffered. And yes, Ernest Hemingway did suffer many concussions throughout his life that may or may not have, been a result of obviously the trauma, but also it caused a lot of his depression, his mental fatigue, his frustration, and his eventual inability to write, which is so tragic. And we've been talking mostly about the war and about sort of the stoic nonchalance of A Farewell to Arms, but obviously we have the romance, so it is sort of a romantic stoic tragedy, or a stoic romance tragedy, or a romantic stoic tragedy, however you want to call it. But like we said, it does sort of function as a form of scripture, not only for people in war and combat, but also just for humanity in general. There's just a certain sense of this character is not going to be beat down, despite the fact that he's already kind of maybe beaten down already, or at least by the end of the novel, he's definitely, beaten down emotionally, mentally. He's drained, he's wounded. Hemingway suffered shrapnel, little pieces of metal, hundreds and thousands of little pieces of metal that were stuck in his leg. He had to do physical therapy. So it's not only a wartime trauma or sort of an anti-war story about the horrors of war and one man's suffering through it, but also what sort of serves as the barrier between the tragedy and the stoicism and the romance is his relationship with Catherine Barclay. And yes, Catherine Barclay was based on a real woman named Agnes von Kurowski, who was a nurse that worked traveled all over the Europe. Eventually she was a successful nurse. Agnes von Kurowski was born in 1892, and she's actually 7 years older than Ernest Hemingway. But Agnes von Kurowski and Ernest Hemingway, obviously they had a fairly large impact on each other, but I will say the impact that Agnes had on Hemingway was much more severe, I guess we could call it. Basically, to make a long story short, Hemingway was wounded. They started flirting at the hospital where Agnes von Kurowski was working in Milan, I believe, and they developed sort of a fairly deep romance from Hemingway's perspective anyway. But according to Agnes von Kurowski, the love was just not as solidified as it was from Hemingway's perspective. I think from Agnes von Kurowski, she was 7 years older. She was already living a successful career. Hemingway was basically just a wounded ambulance driver. He really had no prospects, and I would not hesitate to suspect that she was kind of just flirting with this young Hemingway. Maybe she loved him on some level as a friend, as a brother, as she likes to refer to him as. She ends up sort of referring to the young Hemingway as kid. So you can definitely speculate that it was sort of a very non-committed love on the part of Agnes von Kurowski. The actual details of Hemingway and Agnes von Kurowski unfold in quite a drastically different way than they actually do in the novel. I wouldn't say that Catherine Barkley is a direct inspiration, or that Agnes von Kurowski is the direct inspiration from Catherine Barkley. It's sort of a merging of this ideal version of what Hemingway sort of believed or wanted to believe Agnes von Kurowski was going to be to Hemingway, and sort of Hemingway's brilliant invention. It's obviously an invented character, but it's also inspired by a real woman. And we also have some other important relationships that pop up in the novel, mainly the surgeon Rinaldi, who is quite the character himself. We'll unpack his sort of impact on the novel, his impact on Hemingway later on, as well as the priest. Hemingway has a relationship with a priest that is sort of frequenting the hospital, and you can sort of see where this is going. He's falling in love. He's working, for the Italian artillery, the Italian army, and he hasn't really, this young Frederick Henry / Hemingway has not really seen anything too brutal yet. But as the novel progresses, you can see him sort of start to fall into the thick of warfare. And also what we have with Frederick Henry is that he is not only a very stoic, emotionally invested character, but he has sort of this masculine detachment, which is so fascinating because the novel is about him falling in love, yet he's sort of trying to remain this quintessential, maybe emotionally unavailable male archetype. As the novel progresses, Frederick Henry starts to unveil and starts to let known his emotional, intentions. So although the relationship is sort of tragically doomed, right, we have these beautiful scenes of her and of Catherine Barkley conversing with Hemingway, with Frederick Henry, and as she says here, "And you'll always love me, won't you?" He says, "Yes." "And the rain won't make any difference?" "No." "That's good, because I'm afraid of the rain," she says. "I'll love you always," he says. "I'll love you in the rain and in the snow and in the hail, and what else is there? Go to sleep, darling, and I'll love you no matter how it is." "You're not really afraid of the rain, are you?" he asks. "Not when I'm with you." So just these beautiful, almost, you can definitely see where Charles Bukowski was influenced by Hemingway. Just these short, straight to the point sentences, but they're packed so full of this, as Bukowski would say, delicious little juice. And they're just so poignantly powerful but so daringly tragic at the same time. But the way that Hemingway is able to articulate these characters relating to each other, despite the odds, despite the odds of war, despite the tragedy that romantic relationships often bring, these characters are just trying so hard to hold on tight to what they feel in the moment. And that's also kind of what this novel is. The Lost Generation was only able to really enjoy the moment. Everything that they had known, everything that they had believed had been shattered by World War I, had been shattered by, obviously, the coming Great Depression. And, the term Lost Generation, and basically World War I, as well as some other things that occurred in history, just really totally wiped these characters out. And it not only sort of stunned them on an emotional level, but also sort of a spiritual level. The carnage of World War I was just unprecedented at that time. I jotted down some notes here. War, depression, a beautiful relationship, a beautiful friendship of narrator and Rinaldi. And, like we said, we are going to unpack Rinaldi a little bit. Rinaldi was based on a real person that Hemingway interacted with, but obviously with Hemingway he invented a lot of things. But you'll notice that Rinaldi is very flamboyant. He sort of has this masculine yet very flamboyant way that he relates with Hemingway. He's always kissing Hemingway on the cheek. He's sort of feminine. He's masculine, but he's also feminine in the sense that he's not afraid to show his affections. It might also be a cultural thing, but there's speculation that maybe the character of Rinaldi was supposed to be homosexual or bisexual. Who knows? That's neither here nor there, but you can definitely see where he's and he acts as sort of like a voice of reason, a comic relief perhaps, to sort of like a fool character like Shakespeare, would have had in Hamlet or King Lear. Rinaldi sort of acts as sort of a court gesture or a fool, very akin to the Shakespearean fool in the way that he's able to offer profound sentiments to the sufferings to the main protagonist. We have these beautiful allegories or beautiful references to Adam and Eve from the Bible. And they're very subtle. Hemingway works in a very, very subtle way. And he says here, I think he's talking to Rinaldi. Rinaldi says, "I haven't." Rinaldi said, "Not if they love each other." "Why not?" says Frederick. "They don't like me." "Why not?" "I am the snake," Rinaldi says. "I am the snake of reason." "You're getting it mixed. The apple was reason." "No, it was the snake." He was more cheerful. "You are better when you don't think so deeply," I said. So just these beautiful, really powerful, impactful little ways that Hemingway sprinkles biblical philosophy into his sort of prose. It's just so brilliantly done. The way that Hemingway sort of talks about the socio-political nature of what was going on over there. He says, "They were beaten to start with. They were beaten when they took them from their farms and put them in the army. That is why the peasant has wisdom, because he is defeated from the start. Put him in power and see how wise he is." So almost sort of a, dare I say, Tolstoyan sort of view of the world, the way that the peasants are sort of interacting with the higher culture, socio-political war culture of Europe at the time. And that's what makes for such a fascinating read, is that you're definitely rooting for these characters, because not only is there chaotic warfare occurring around them, but you also see that just the tragedy of the situation, what's about to unfold there. But meanwhile, Frederick and Catherine have all these lofty romantic dreams together. You have those. You also share those dreams with these characters, which I think is just so impactful. Towards the end of the novel, a series of events occur that I'm not going to tell you guys about because I want you to read it for yourselves. It's basically all-encompassing. A Farewell to Arms is obviously an anti-war novel, perhaps, but it's also one of the most poignant novels from the Lost Generation, but it's also a story of romance, a tragic wartime romance. But having said that, we have the stoicism that occurs. We have sort of this acceptance, this almost Buddhist-esque embracing of suffering, which is just so beautiful, but it's also a Christian embracing of suffering. We have this character that is not unlike Christ, who is completely forsaken. My annotation here says, although a bland and cold-natured ending, Hemingway's sparse vagueness leaves room for the imaginative potential endings for readers and characters. So that's something else that I forgot to mention that's so brilliant about A Farewell to Arms, is that the ending leaves so much for interpretation. It's not this philosophical Tolstoyan ending. It's not this over-the-top, flowery Thomas Wolfe type deal, which I love. I love those, heartfelt explanations from people like Tolstoy and Thomas Wolfe, or somebody like Jack Kerouac, or somebody perhaps like Faulkner. But very similar to Faulkner, sort of the explanations, the worldview that is constructed comes from the character and the character's interaction. There's not a lot of sort of omnipresent Wolfian, Tolstoyan background narration. Basically, the worldview is presented to you literally by the characters' interactions and by their internal monologue, which is very little. But, I don't want to give too much away behind the background of Hemingway and Agnes von Kurowski, but it is one of the most fascinating yet tragic stories romantically, as well as what happened with the war of any any literary writer. Just a very beautiful way that Hemingway was able to not only capture his autobiographical story, his own trauma, his emotional trauma, his physical trauma, but also the way that it relates to the social historical narrative of the lost generation, as well as many generations to come. So please, leave your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what edition you like of A Farewell to Arms. This one in particular is the Scribner Library edition, which actually has samples from Hemingway's, real notebook, something called A Very Short Story that occurs with Hemingway, as well as many other works by Hemingway that include his relationship with Agnes von Kurowski. And he wrote about it continuously throughout his life, so we can definitely see where the impact of not only war, but also heartbreak had a lasting impact on Ernest Hemingway. Thank you so much for watching, y'all, and we'll see you guys in the next one.